Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. An official welcome to everybody joining us today, our friends, to our art enthusiasts, to museum dedicated audience members. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar series. It's actually the final program in our summer series, but we wisely scheduled it for the beginning of the fall, so it would be kind of out there and advertised. So today's topic is From Social Realism to Photorealism, Post-1945 Highlights from the Palmer Bequest. And Joyce Robinson, our Assistant Director, we are looking forward to having you here and talking on this subject today. So I'm excited to hear as well. Before we get started, I do want to share with you, I'm Brandy Breslin. If you haven't met me yet, I'm the museum educator, and I am compelled to share with you some upcoming programs. So we do have our fall program series is set. Here we go. And so I wanted to share with you, I will go through quickly. I promise I won't take too much time on these. We have some virtual tours that I wanted to make sure you know about because the museum is scheduled to reopen in early January, but you can still connect remotely and virtually. One way is through these virtual tours. If you haven't gone through and experienced any of them yet, they are self-directed, interactive tours that feature a selection of artwork with video tour guides, so to speak. And you can explore at your own pace. You can watch a little bit, come back, watch some later. There's also text, there's large images. It certainly doesn't replace visiting in person, but it comes in a great second. So, and for those of you in Colorado or beyond too, that's a great access point for you. So we have these 3 different tours available right now. During the program, probably near the end, I'll put the access links for you in the chat box. So go ahead and look for those. We have 2 that are geared really towards university students, that maybe for upper level secondary students, and then one that's kind of geared more towards the elementary, middle school, K-12 students. So do check those out. I also wanted to let you know, if you happen to be a faculty member joining us today, that we are making available this sort of opportunity for classes that are meeting via remote synchronous Zoom classes. If you are accustomed to coming to the museum, you still can get this into your schedule. Just contact me, email me, and let me know that you're looking for this. And we will show up in your class Zoom and sort of present this introduction to the Palmer with sort of wide variety of the collections, some selected works to talk about, discuss in more depth. So hopefully some of you might add that to your syllabus still. And I did want to let you know also about our popular summer series of videos. The Museum Sketchbook series will be continuing in the fall, coming sort of mid to late September. It's going to shift to be called Online Art Club, and the videos will remain very similar, where people can participate in them at their own levels. They're, no matter what age or skill level, artistic skill level, you'll be able to participate. But our live online events connected to that will be for children and families. So that'll be exciting. So look for more information on that as they start happening and as those live online events get scheduled. I also wanted to let you know that our webinar series continues. This sort of virtual talk solution for us. During the fall, we're going to shift those more into conversation mode instead of the presentation mode. So do join us for these. We'll be pairing museum staff, graduate students, and even undergraduate interns for more conversation style discussion. And the theme of this series is around sort of museum inner workings of the museum, so behind the scenes, so to speak, and you can see the variety of programs we have planned already. We do have the access links available, and again, I will put in my in the chat box a link for you to get all of these individual links as well. So do plan on joining us for more of these, and you will note that the times have changed. They're no longer scheduled for Fridays around noon, but we're looking for a later afternoon to early evening time period to kind of try out some of those different times. All right, so we're getting back to our talk at hand. As I stop sharing and Joyce sets her PowerPoint to share, I just want to remind you that I will be monitoring the chat box during Joyce's talk. So if you have a question that comes up Maybe she advanced a slide and you didn't get a good look at something, put it in the chat box and I will stop her for you to address it. But for the most part, we're going to save questions and conversation to the end, where I can activate your audio and you can participate and ask that question directly. So it looks like Joyce is all set, and without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Joyce, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Brandy. It's so nice to be here in my own living room talking to you all. What a funny time. I, of course, wish we could be together in the museum talking about these wonderful works, but then we wouldn't have our Colorado contingent with us. So there's certainly some bright sides to this, but I do look forward to the time soon when we can all be back together and enjoy these works. And today we're going to be looking at, I'm going to focus on 9 works. You can see, so I know I've got a lot to do in the time that we have together. You can see that I'm kind of in Brady Bunch Zoom mode thinking in the way I've presented them for you, but you'll see an array of works here that really do kind of cover that period from social realism, sort of 1940s, up to what I'm calling photorealism along the bottom, and we're going to tease out what that term means in relationship to these works, but certainly works that date much later in the 20th century. So I do want to say this is a reprise of, a sort of a reprise of a talk that I gave as a pop-up talk of, gosh, I guess it was last year ago spring. 2019, we received the bequest from James and Barbara Palmer. We lost Jim nearly 2 decades ago. I find that hard to believe, 2001. And we lost Barbara in 2019. And as I think many of you know, we received nearly 200 works of art from the bequest. And they are now in the museum, and we have added them to our permanent collection, of course. And it's just delightful to be able to work with these wonderful works. Now, I think many people, when they think of Jim and Barbara's collection, they think of notable 19th century American artists, think of Church and Heed, Cassatt. They also think of Ashcan realism, Stieglitz modernism, Marsden Hartley, Georgia O'Keeffe. But we also certainly have many works that date from post-war, from post-1945. In fact, if you count, and I'm sorry if you're hearing my dings from my email, sorry, I think it'll stop soon. If you count the ceramics that are part of their collection, and certainly their sculpture, a number of pieces by Seymour Lipton, over half the bequest really dates from post-war, from post-1945. And today we're going to be talking about a variety of realisms. Again, going from social realism across the top there, the bottom row to photorealism, and in the middle, something I'm calling kind of nature-based modernist realism. Realism is one of those tricky terms. It can mean naturalism. It can mean realism in terms of subject matter. It can mean representational. So we'll talk about all those kinds of realisms. I do want to point out, though, oops, I am trying to move forward here. There we go. That it's certainly not exclusively, the post-war work is not exclusively made up of realist works. In fact, Barbara and Jim were great champions of abstraction. And this is just a little teaser of some of the works that are in the collection, and maybe we'll have a part 2, Palmer Bequest, and look at some of the abstract works. But this amazing drawing on the left by Lee Bontecu, recent acquisitions that Barbara made by Morris Blackburn, Judith Rothschild. And I will point out the Morton Schomburg piece there from 1918. And I'm pointing that out because Morton Schomburg died in the influenza epidemic of 1918. You know, I've always taught that to my courses. I've always mentioned that, oh yes, there was a great pandemic. Wow, I think we all have a bit more of an understanding now of what that means, right? So back, oh, and I will also point out too, that there are other kinds of realism involved in Barbara and Jim's collection, now the Palmer Museum of Art collection. Certainly we could talk about magic realists like Paul Cadmus and George Tooker, but we will save that too for another episode. So back to our grid, and we're going to start with Robert Gwathmey. And this remarkable painting called Lullaby in 1945 that is right now hanging in the museum. Of course, we can't be there to see it, but we have had it on view recently. And, you know, I think it's interesting because Guathme is one of those artists that is not terribly well known, at least not today. It's certainly, his name is not a household name, but a figure who really had quite a prominent career mid-century. Considered himself, if he had to describe himself, he was very reticent, very humble. He never dated his paintings because he thought it was pretentious. But he said, you know, I'm interested in the human figure. I'm interested in the human condition. And one reason I'm showing photos of all the artists today, but one reason I'm showing Guathme's photo is because there's long been confusion. It's been thought that he was an African-American artist because his subjects focused almost exclusively on Black Southern culture, particularly agriculture. And it's still confusing to historians today, and it was in fact confusing in his time. Now, Guathme was a white Southerner. He was an 8th generation Virginian. He grew up near Richmond, but he made his way north to study art. He studied at the Pennsylvania Academy for 4 years in the late 20s. Biographers have suggested that it's when he was in Philadelphia that he really started to become an activist. In fact, he was part of a group that approached Albert Barnes about donating money towards buying ambulances for the Spanish Civil War. And this kind of politicized activism is something that continued throughout his life. He met his wife, you'll hear more about her in just a second, in Philadelphia at PAFA, but he also lived in Pittsburgh for a time, late 1939 to 42, and then he and his wife moved to New York, and he went on to teach at the Cooper Union for many years, 1942 to 1968. But he certainly is best known, as I've said, for his Southern Black subjects. As a white Southerner, he was very intrigued by these themes. And he is certainly someone that we would call a social, pardon me, social realist. And what we mean by social realist is that there's an interest in trying to expose social injustices to subjects that deal with exploitation, whether from capitalism or racism or white privilege. And many of his paintings feature black crows, a reference to Jim Crow segregation. They feature barbed wire, again, a kind of reference to segregation, often focused on Black working figures. He was very much sort of taken by the notion of sharecropping and troubled by the economic exploitation of sharecropping. And you can see on the right, this remarkable painting that's at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester called Nonfiction, where you see a small girl holding a younger sibling. That same motif repeats in Hoeing on the left, which was acquired by the Carnegie Museum of Art in 1943. What a remarkable, this nonfiction, what a remarkable painting, because it has to do with minstrelsy and the sort of fallacy of that kind of performative culture alongside something that he thought was, a much more heartfelt and meaningful kind of aspect of Black culture. Now, in addition to being from the South, Robert Guathme was able to get a Julius Rosenwald Fellowship in 1944. This was a fellowship. Julius Rosenwald was part of the Sears Roebuck enterprise, funded a number of programs and schools throughout the South, particularly funded Black writers and artists, but also funded white Southerners who were interested in sort of reckoning, if you will, with the South and the situation, racial situation in the South in these years. As I mentioned, Robert married his wife Rosalie when they were in Philadelphia, and Rosalie in her own right was a wonderful photographer. She went on to be a member of the Photo League. After they moved to New York, she donated her photos many of them to the New York Public Library. And it's interesting to see these. She accompanied him in 1944 with this Rosenwald Fellowship. They went down to North Carolina and spent the summer working on a tobacco farm because Guathme felt like he certainly needed to participate in this life if he was going to depict it. In terms of stylistic influences, you can see that certainly we would put him in the modernist camp. He was always interested in that sort of architectural modernist structure. You notice the sort of flattening of the planes, the compartmentalized colors. He's not particularly interested in chiaroscuro or atmospheric perspective. So even though it is a realist subject or representational subject, there is this kind of modernist approach to the figure. We know he was looking at artists like Georges Rouault, and on the left, you can see the old king, which he would have certainly seen at the Carnegie Museum of Art. And of course, Rouault was looking at stained glass, as was Guathmé, and that same kind of use of heavy dark lines, compartmentalizing of color, you certainly see evident in Lullaby. So I just also want to say too that in this picture, of course, we're not talking about agricultural work. We're talking about a mother and child relationship, and Guathmé pointed out that this was, for him, a universal image. It was less about Black vernacular culture than it was a universal kind of relationship. And critics at the time pointed out the scribbles on the wall in the back, saying that, oh, it was typical of the child and typical of the race. And Guathmé said, well, those are actually my child's drawings from his bedroom wall. And so he really was thinking about the universal import of this. And this work, Lullaby, was shown in 1946. Guathmé had a major show at the ACA Galleries in New York. None other than Paul Robeson wrote the introduction to the catalog and actually singled out Lullaby, noting that it revealed the beauty and dignity of the Southern Negro. This was an important time for Guathmé. Lullaby also went on to win a prize, the Pepsi Cola, I think, competition it was called, sponsored by. So this is a work that was well known at the time. It was commented on at the time as well. And I will just leave you with Guathmé here. I mean, we'll move on, but I will just point out that Rosalie and Robert were both card-carrying members of the Communist Party. And they both were under surveillance by the FBI for 27 years until 1969. And according to the FBI files, the worst thing they could find to say about him was that his most noticeable characteristic was, quote, his lack of prejudice of any kind. So they stopped surveilling him. And speaking of universal themes, mother and child, we move on now to this fantastic collage from Mary Bearden's untitled Mother and Child Collage on Board that also was hanging recently at the museum. And you see a photo of Bearden there. And in the background, I just want you to note his grandparents. They're gonna come back in just a minute. But Bearden spent much of his life in New York, though like Guathmé, he was a Southerner. He was born near Charlotte in North Carolina, but he is one of these artists who really is interested in both the Southern side and the urban side, and the what we might call the kind of iconic territories of the early 20th century African-American experience, from Charlotte to Greensboro to Pittsburgh to Harlem. All of these locations certainly appear in his art. So though he was a Southerner, he ends up living much of his life in New York, and particularly in Harlem. Now, Bearden undergoes an interesting sort of, not really transformation, but just an interesting evolution in terms of style, beginning as a realist and kind of coming back to being a realist. And so none of these works are in our collection, but I just thought I would give you a quick, very quick look at where his work goes. So it really begins as a social realist. 1941, you see this work called The Visitation, two African-American women, but yet the title suggests almost a biblical import, The Visitation. 1945, he becomes very interested in sort of what he would call universal human themes, Christian themes. This is called He is Arisen. He too is looking at stained glass at that time, 1945. He's also interested in themes from Homer's Odyssey, etc. He then comes about 1960 or so, 50 is really, to complete abstraction. And like many Black artists in this period, was sort of questioning what his responsibility was in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. He's part of a group called Spiral with other Black artists who, again, are interested in abstraction, but wondering what their responsibilities are to their communities. And he comes ultimately back to a kind of realism, sort of certainly modernist inflected realism, but he really becomes a great champion of collage. And you see a wonderful example there, 1964, the prevalence of ritual baptism, which is a collage, as I mentioned. So we were very delighted to add this. I was very delighted to add this to our collection. And I should mention too that these are all works that I have written about in the Gift from the Heart catalog that we did of Barbara and Jim's collection in 2013. So these are works that I've thought about a lot and that I know very well and that I certainly love. And so, you know, Bearden, as you could tell from that little survey that we just did, was certainly interested, again, in the kind of universal import. Yes, using the Black subject, but experiences that are common to all humans. And one way he sort of felt like he could further this was to look at past art. And we know that Bearden would take compositional elements from Italian Renaissance paintings, from Degas, French Impressionism, from Byzantine art. And he would use those compositions, those ideas, and he would sort of update them, if you will. And we know, or we suspect, at least I think, that our collage here, this mother and child, is based on this icon of the Virgin and Child. It's known as the Vladimir icon, early 12th century. Was taken to Moscow and is now in a church in, I think it's Trimucki. And this detail over to the right, I'm showing you there. I know you might think that that's a very strange little detail. It looks like maternal hair. It looks like the Madonna's hair, but it's really, I guess it's the left arm of the baby reaching all the way around. Everybody see that? Those little fingers over there? And you can certainly see that in Bearden's collage as well. Now, if we compare this collage to the image that we were just looking at, that prevalence of ritual, you can see that this he's sort of hesitant to fracture these figures, these sacred figures, if you will, but still interested in, a modern sort of rhythmic, syncopated, patterned expression of this universal subject matter. I love that stripe of green that comes across, just sort of boldly announcing itself. Also, that pattern, which sort of suggests an African source, but we weren't able to find a specific source for it, but it does sort of add that kind of sort of element to it. And we know, that Bearden was certainly very upfront about these kinds of sources. And in 1945, he wrote to a friend, he said, "I've tried to learn the design of pictures studying Byzantine painting and the old Italian primitives, not to seek surface elements," he said, "but essences, to get at the essence of this sacred relationship." And I will just sort of leave this image with just talking a little bit about, you might notice in Bearden's collage that the skin tones are not, perhaps we might say, stable or fixed. There's certainly brown paper that he's using. There's lighter colored paper. Note the difference between the mother's skin and the child's skin. Also, the child's face is different from the darker hand and the arm reaching across the front. And I think this has everything to do with Bearden's own experience in the world and in his family. He certainly identified as African-American, was African-American, was very light-skinned. You can see a picture of him up there with his grandfather. Very light-skinned, blonde as a child. And he was, when he was 3 years old, walking down the street in Charlotte with his darker-skinned father. He was forcibly taken away from his father because it was assumed that this was a child that couldn't possibly belong to this man. And so I think for him, this has a lot to do with his own sort of mixed identity, not mixed identity, because it wasn't mixed, but sort of unstable identity, and kind of the opposite of Gwathmey, perhaps. I think at times people thought that Bearden was white. And it's interesting, I have the picture at the bottom up because Bearden's friend, Ralph Ellison, the great writer, once quipped, well, he really looked more Russian than black, he said. And so I sort of like that in context, talking about this with the Byzantine icon. But it's a gorgeous work, and certainly one that I hope you'll get to see in person. Our last image along the top, and I know I really have to get moving here, is Confrontation at the Bridge by Jacob Lawrence. And this is a work that, wow, 1975, a work that is as timely today as it was when it was, probably more so perhaps than when it was created in 1975. Jacob Lawrence, one of the great, like Bearden's, one of the great American artists of the 20th century. You can see he lived 1917 to 2000. You see photos of him here as a young man. Like Bearden, he too lived for many of his early years in Harlem, in New York. And you actually see him in the lower image there as part of a student at the Harlem Community Workshops. For those of you who saw the Augusta Savage show that we had on view, you might remember that Lawrence was really one of the young artists that was very much influenced by her. He goes on, though, to, oh, I'm hearing thunder. I don't know if you all are hearing it. He goes on, though, to become, to leave New York. In 1970, he was hired as a visiting professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, and 1971 became a full professor there, and went on to teach and have a long career as a professor at the University of Washington. So this work, Confrontation at the Bridge, it's a gouache or an opaque watercolor, again from 1975. I show you this work. This is the Migration series by Jacob Lawrence, of course, probably the series he's best known for. And what I really want to point out is that this is an artist who was interested in the Black subject, but was interested in sort of historical narratives. And he often worked sequentially, worked in series. The Migration series that he created in 1941, 60 panels. So it's a huge, vast series that is charting this massive demographic shift of African Americans from the South to the North, to Chicago, to New York, to St. Louis. This was shown in the early 1940s at the Edith Halpert Gallery in New York, and it made his reputation. And MoMA and the Phillips Collection both wanted to buy the series at the time, and they ultimately decided they could both buy it, and so they split it. I can't remember, I think the Phillips has the odd numbered ones, MoMA has the even, I might have that backwards. But this is a major, major series, but you can see Lawrence's style that is deceptively simple, right? It is influenced by, inflected by synthetic cubism, and it is sort of highly colorful, highly patterned, but as I said, sort of deceptively simple, because what Lawrence is interested in is the narrative content. He wants you to understand that story. He doesn't want you to get distracted by chiaroscuro or naturalistic light effects. He wants you to concentrate on the essences of this story. This particular image from 1975, Confrontation at the Bridge, was actually commissioned, Lawrence was commissioned to create this image in honor of the bicentennial, and it was part of a larger portfolio of prints. And you see on the right, the print, screen print, after our original image. And so I just want everyone to be clear. The image that Barbara and Jim had, the image that we now have, is the original gouache, the original idea, and then a screen print was made. And sorry, this was the best shot I could get. You could tell I was on my computer, but this particular image is at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And as I mentioned, certainly this is a timely image. Scholars have suggested that, well, this must be the 1963 March on Birmingham, when peaceful protesters were met by fire hoses and attack dogs. Others have suggested, of course, that it is the Edmund Pettus Bridge March that we've just heard so much about recently. And by the way, today is the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington. And I think it's bigger than that. I think it is both of these, and it is more. It is a group of peaceful protesters who are expressing their discontent in a peaceful kind of way, and who look at that snarling canine there, that cipher of evil, of brutality on the left, and you just look at the stalwart strength of these figures, and certainly it is a moving image. And I would just remind folks too that with Jacob Lawrence, you know, there's ladders, there's trains, there's stairways, this kind of movement away out of the South, this movement towards something better. And notice that bridge, even though there is a confrontation, it is ascending, and this group is going to be moving to a better place. And we have to believe that. Okay, so I want to switch to that middle rung of my Brady Bunch Zoom grouping of works, and we're going to talk about 3 works, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but just want to show you these remarkable works. And you know, when I was working on the catalog of the collection, I wrote about these 3 works together. So we're looking at John Marin, Milton Avery, and Charles Birchfield. And what I realized when I was working on these works is that they're all 3 examples of very, very late works by these really remarkable artists. But in all cases, they are among really, I think, the best works of these artists' careers. John Marin, American artist, as you can see there on the left. Marin is certainly someone who we associate with early 20th century American modernism and the circle of artists around Alfred Stieglitz. He has his first one-man show in 1910 with Stieglitz, and really he's quite well known for the kind of image that you see on the left, these dynamic, syncopated, wonderful, sort of modernist renderings of the city, capturing the dynamism of the city. He was particularly taken with the Woolworth Building, the Brooklyn Bridge, and this downtown district, Manhattan, from 1929 is actually in our collection now too. This was owned by Barbara. Barbara and Jim owned 4 works by Marin. And I neglected to say that Marin began his earliest work, he worked as an architectural draftsman, and he was born in 1870. He counted Whistler among his influences, and then you look at this painting on the right and you think, wow, that's quite a long career. But there's a kind of scaffolding, right, that a kind of linear scaffolding, I think, that informs his work, whether it is downtown district Manhattan or landscape. Now, we're going to just take a look quickly. These are some pictures of Marin later in life, a wonderful haircut. And landscape, Marin, though he was tied to the city, he also lived much of his time in Maine. He moved there in 1933, maintained a house there, and was particularly drawn to images of the water. But also to landscape. And the work on the right, it's actually on the back, it's inscribed untitled, but it has come to be known as landscape. And you can just make out a hint of sky, a hint of blue wash. And I should mention too that Marin was just a master of watercolor, a hint of blue. And then is that a mountain? Is that a hill? It doesn't really matter. But we can see that just at the top, we have this moment where land is meeting the heavens. And then look at that mountainside, that hilltop, that foreground, this sort of just remarkable sort of Dionysian frenzy of applying watercolor and ink. Now, 1951, Marin was 81 years old when he is creating this. And we know, scholars have told us, that he was hospitalized about this time, 1950, 1951, had a series of hospitalizations, and he watched a nurse with a syringe, gave him an idea, and so pretty sure that in this work, those ink splatters that you see are probably applied with a syringe. And of course, what does it call to mind? What do you think of? 1951, well, we think of abstract expressionism, we think of Jackson Pollock. And I'll point out that at this time, in the 40s and certainly early 50s, Marin was considered by critics to be really one of the most important American artists of his time. In fact, critic Clement Greenberg in 1942 said it is quite possible that he is the greatest living American painter. And in 1950, just a year before this was painted, Marin was featured at the Venice Biennale in the American Pavilion alongside Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Arshile Gorky. And we know that Clement Greenberg, in part, one reason he is extolling Marin is because it sort of creates a national lineage for the abstract expressionists, right? Marin would never give himself completely over to abstraction. It was always about, remaining representational, painting what he called, I think, the big disorder within the order of the cosmos. And it's just a splendid, splendid example by this remarkable octogenarian. Another very, very late work, another watercolor too, a painting titled Butterfly, Watercolor, Butterfly and Poppies by Charles Birchfield. Now, Birchfield is quite an interesting figure. Another one of these artists that perhaps is not a household name today, but is someone who certainly was an important presence in American art. But unlike Marin, who spent much of his time in New York and then in Maine, Birchfield was really much more, I don't really want to say provincial, but he was away from the center of the art world in New York. He was from Central Ohio. He had studied at the Cleveland School of Art. He graduated there in 1916. He moved to Buffalo in 1921, worked as a wallpaper designer, and then ultimately decided to try to make his career as an artist, but spent most of his life really working in and around the Buffalo area. Now, like Bearden, it's sort of fun to look at the trajectory of Birchfield's career. And we're very blessed that Barbara and Jim had these three works in their collection, and they very wonderfully, beautifully show the trajectory of Birchfield's career. This splendid Fauve-inspired modernist September Sun and Waterfall on the left from 1915, what a glorious work. In the middle, Street Scene, Sun and Shadow from about 1933. Birchfield goes through a kind of American scene painting, a bit more dark, somber period in the 30s. Critics have described it as like Edward Hopper on a rainy day. And then certainly in his later career, given over back to kind of the beauty of nature, landscape, some of which are almost sort of cosmic in the way they express the wonders of the natural world. But I want to talk to you a little bit more about our particular watercolor and just show you here a photograph of Birchfield taken by a wonderful photographer, Dwayne Michaels. This is Birchfield and his wife in their garden in 1966. As I mentioned, Birchfield, once he left the wallpaper designing business and decided he was going to devote full time to his art, he and his wife moved to near West Seneca, New York, to a town called Gardenville. And basically they remained there for the rest of their lives and very much, I think, delighted in the simple pleasures of home and garden. Birchfield wrote to a friend not too long after moving there and said, "How this stretch of land has grown into my heart." I think for many of us, all of us who are stuck at home these days, it's been wonderful to have these gardens and backyards where we can spend some time thinking about things other than the pandemic. And so this painting is very, very late in Birchfield's career, this watercolor, Butterfly and Poppies. And you'll notice the span of dates there, 1950 to 66. This was not uncommon for Birchfield, these kind of two-period paintings. He would go back and revisit works that he'd already started. So clearly this is a work that he had started in 1950, and he decides to finish it in 66. And I'll point out again that Birchfield dies in 1967. So this is, just was several months before he was passing. Before he passed, we know that he was getting his life and his estate in order. He established the Charles Birchfield Center at Buffalo State College in 1966. He also established the Birchfield Foundation. So he was getting his life in order here toward the end. And we know from an inscription on the back of this watercolor that this was a gift to his sister, Louise. And on the back, it is inscribed, given to my sister Louise on her birthday, August 9th, 1966, from Bertha and Charlie. And I'll just point out to you these gorgeous butterflies and bees that are hovering around these poppies. Notice, by the way, the signature at the bottom. This is Birchfield's monogram, this C-E-B. And notice the E becomes almost like a butterfly. It's actually based on the ram horns of his zodiac sign. But I think there's a kind of ascendant V-shaped movement like those butterflies. And, you know, I don't want to read too much into it, but when we think about butterflies and birth and renewal, we think about poppies and kind of the sleep of death. I think Birchfield is pondering some of these things here at the end of his life, even as he is enjoying the sort of lush sensuality of this summer in his own backyard. All right, we're coming in. We just have a few more minutes here. And so I don't want to overlook this fantastic late Milton Avery, another of what I would call these kind of nature-inspired, almost abstraction realist paintings. This is called Tangerine Moon and Wine Dark Sea, 1959, a watercolor and oil pastel on paper. And you're also seeing another work from the Palmer collection too, this sort of delightful little image of beach birds scuttling along the shore. Milton Avery, again, like Birchfield, another sort of interesting, almost anomalous figure, a figure who early in the 20th century was greatly admired for his modernist, very, very simple kind of subjects, but modernist, almost Picasso-like and particularly Matisse-like images, such as Picture Painter, which is a work that is in the Palmer Museum of Art, has been at Penn State for quite a long time, from 1945. Avery is someone who was very much tied to New York, and we know that in the 1920s and 30s, his studio was a favorite gathering place for people named Adolf Gottlieb and Mark Rothko, folks like that. That was in the 20s and 30s. What we know too is that those were friendships that were maintained. Milton Avery, friends with Gottlieb and Rothko. Let me show you these, here we go. And we know too that all three of them were in Provincetown together at the end of the 50s. And certainly when we think about a work like Tangerine Moon and Wine Dark Sea, Milton Avery, you know, we can see that it is very much bordering on abstraction, has a similar kind of luminous glowing rectangles of a Mark Rothko, a similar bifurcation of the composition that Gottlieb has. So this, like Birchfield and Marin, these works, these late works are, I think, among the artist's best, and critics have agreed with that. And they point out too that there is also a painting in oil with the same name, 1959. Sorry, this is the best reproduction I could find of it, working remotely. But it's wonderful because it shows you the inspiration for this piece. And it basically, Avery was in Provincetown. He was looking out across the water. And just quickly, I'll read here. It says, weeks of wet weather had discouraged me. Then the day cleared. The atmosphere was still oppressive. That evening, I sat on my deck facing Provincetown Bay. The water was moody, wine dark, which is a reference to Homer. Across the bay, the lights of Wellfleet were a row of buttons on the horizon. Suddenly above the lights appeared a surprising moon, tangerine in color and shape. It made magic. A week later, I painted Tangerine Moon and Wine Dark Sea. And whether he's referring to the painting there, the canvas, or the watercolor, I don't think it matters. I think just a remarkable very, I don't want to say forward thinking, but a kind of remarkable, prescient sort of color field painting by an artist that we associate perhaps with other kinds of artwork, earlier modernist artwork. And I'll just leave you too with this image with Wolf Kahn, a contemporary artist who recently passed away, who talked about Milton Avery and said, you know, his late works were the best. And you can see this Wolf Kahn also from the Palmer collection there in the upper left, very much, I think, indebted to the Milton Avery. So I know I have like 5 minutes left. And so I am just going to give you a little bit of a taste of some of these other works, and we could perhaps we can have a part 2 and talk about photorealism a little bit in more depth, but just want to talk about this remarkable watercolor called Leslie from 1986, Leslie number 2, by Chuck Close. And instead of showing you a photo of Chuck Close, I'm showing you, well, there is a photo on the left, but I'm showing you one of his hyperrealist, photorealist works, the Big Self-Portrait of 1968, a very, very large canvas that's now at the Walker Art Center. And of course, we think of Chuck Close as the quintessential photorealist, who transferring, you know, information from black and white photographs and recreating that sort of inch by inch by inch, dividing up that original image and gridding it out and then transferring, and almost like, you know, in the sort of old master way, except he's using air brushes and things to create this remarkable illusion. Now, I think many folks know that Chuck Close in late 1988 had a catastrophic event involving a spinal artery collapse, which has left him severely paralyzed. However, he is still able to paint. But I want to point out that the Palmer image on the right was painted prior to that event. So this shift towards a more sort of abstract mode, but still grid-based, and still portrait-based, what happened before this accident. So he was already moving in this, what we might call pixelated direction. And I'll just point out too that our watercolor from 1986, number 2, reason it's number 2 is because at the same time he was creating this first one, which clearly is based on a photograph of Leslie, who was his wife, no longer his wife, but she was at the time. And you can see that he's working in both modes at the same time, almost still photorealist, and then this more sort of abstracted, dynamic, again, let's call it a pixelated mode. And what we know too is that Close is actually, one reason he's moving in this direction in this case, is that he is preparing, he's thinking about a woodcut that is going to be inspired by this image, by our watercolor. And this is a well-traveled little watercolor. It has been over to Japan. Chuck sent it ahead to a studio where Tadashi Toda, a Japanese printmaker, could create the wood blocks and help with this color woodcut print, which was published by Crown Point Press in 1986. So I know we're getting at the end of time. And so I'm not really, oh, I love these images of Chuck Close. I'm not really going to talk too much about Deborah Birmingham, other than to say this gorgeous, beautiful still life that really is a kind of homage to her father, Little Sir John, 1994. And then I'll end too with this image of Ad Astra by Dan Massid, who, you know, I failed to mention that Jim and Barbara love to get to know the artists, contemporary artists represented in their collection. They were great supporters of Deborah Birmingham, of Dan Massid. And I'll leave you with this still life, which it is a kind of portrait. We won't go into it. It's called Ad Astra. Just remarkable pastel image by this wonderful artist, Dan Massid. And Ad Astra per aspera, you may know this Latin phrase, to the stars through adversity. And I wanted to end on that note because we're all living in this time together and we are looking forward. So Ad Astra, to the stars, through adversity, we'll get beyond this. And I'm going to leave it there because it's almost 1 o'clock. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joyce. It was wonderful. Um, so at this point, we'll be glad to open up. I didn't see any questions come in through the chat. Nobody had a chance because it was so thoroughly enjoyable, but there are maybe beginning to have questions come in. I just closed my chat inadvertently. Sorry, everybody. Here we go. And I will gladly be able to open up your audio and add you to the conversation if you have a question that you would like to pose. We're getting a lot of thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Joyce. Wonderful. I concur. Any questions out there?
It was very thorough. No.
Yes, it was.
No, and of course, there's always so much more to say, you know, and I too much to talk about, but I do think there's so many avenues we could pursue, and you know, we'll do it again.
Right. That's
Some of these other works.
Tease, right, for the next opportunity to come together and look at some of these works that you weren't able to go into depth about. A question from Linda Gall. Linda, would you be open to posing the question? There it is. I'm going to open up your, there you go, Linda. If you take yourself off mute, you should be able to ask your question.
Great, thank you. Joyce, this was wonderful. Thanks so much. I was just curious about Homer Bearden's materials that he might have used for his collage. You made reference to paper when you were talking about the mother and child piece, but was it all paper that he used? Did he paint the, color the paper himself, or I don't know, just curious.
You know, I think in general, he these are colored papers. Yes, essentially all paper that he's working with here. But particularly if you look sort of at the chin of the mother, that's sort of greenish. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't seen this in a while, but up close. But yeah, I think he would sometimes paint some of the papers and then, yes, collage them together. He also would photocopy some images. He would tear things out of magazines, and he would actually use, it's actually called photostat. He would use those black and white enlargements, and he really was, I think, quite inventive as an artist, and particularly with collage. But does that answer your question, Linda?
Thank you.
Great.
Great, nice. I have another hand raised by Jason. I'm going to go ahead and click you on. If you unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Yes, hi. Two questions, actually. First of all, your talk was very enlightening and terrific, and I liked everything you had to say, but I have a couple of questions about Bearden. The first question is, who influenced him? And secondly, why is he not better known today, do you think?
Oh, interesting. Well, I do think he's pretty well known, but I think maybe it is, well, there's a larger issue of Black artists, I think, being sort of omitted from the canonical narratives historically. So, sorry, I'm just going to go into a little personal thing here. I became interested in African-American art well into my graduate school studies. I had never heard of any, honestly, I did not know any Black artists from my undergraduate art history courses, not even Jacob Lawrence, who made it into some survey texts. And so I think, there's just historically, there's been, these artists have been eclipsed. I do think Bearden certainly has come into his own. There have been some major shows in recent years. He studied with George Grosz, German expressionist artist. We know he looked certainly, everybody was looking at Picasso, and particularly synthetic cubist Picasso. Think of Guernica, and sort of influence there. Looking at African art was also important for Jacob Lawrence too. Yeah, so I think, and he was very much in the circle of abstract artists, not only Black abstract painters, but white painters as well, and just very much sort of interested in what was going on in the New York art scene. So I think this is changing. And if you look at survey texts of American art, you now have figures certainly like Jacob Lawrence and Bearden. There should be many others, but we're starting to know their names.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your question and participation, Jason. Anyone else before we wind up for the day? Any other questions? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. No hands raised.
I will say one last thing, that we are hoping to, not hoping, we are going to highlight works from the Palmer Bequest in an exhibition coming up next summer. We're calling it An American Place, Highlights from the Palmer Bequest. So we will have a chance to see these and many, many more wonderful works.
Definitely look forward to that. There's the talk part 2, of course, if not sooner.
Right. Right.
All right. Well, a final thank you to everyone for joining us today, and Joyce for leading us through a lovely discovery of some of these works in depth. So thank you for preparing and leading us through that. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Until we see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Boy, don't get wet in the storm.